The autumn fog crept in from Boston Harbor, a damp gray shroud that smothered the gas lamps of Beacon Hill. It clung to the narrow cobblestone streets and slick brick townhouses, muffling the sounds of the waking city. Arthur Vance, at 68, knew this weather by heart. He'd spent 4 decades navigating this neighborhood, first as a wide-eyed doctoral student and finally as a distinguished professor of African American history at Boston University. Retirement, which he'd accepted 3 months prior, hadn't changed his internal clock. At 5:45 a.m., he was in his kitchen, the kettle whistling. He spooned loose-leaf tea into a pot, the ritual precise, unchanged. He'd traded lecture halls for quiet mornings with the Boston Globe and stacks of books he finally had time to read, not just assign. His apartment on Acorn Street was small but immaculate, every inch a testament to a life of intellectual order. At 6:15 a.m., he buttoned his wool pea coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped out into the dense fog. His morning walk through the Common was sacrosanct, a time to think. He'd walk for exactly 45 minutes, buy a fresh scone from the bakery on Charles Street, and be home by 7:30 to start his research. He was a familiar, respected figure in the neighborhood, a tall, lean black man with a halo of white hair and a thoughtful gaze, always ready with a polite nod. On the morning of October 28, 1998, a neighbor saw him turn the corner onto Beacon Street, his silhouette sharp against the fog for a moment before it dissolved entirely. The neighbor went back to retrieving his paper, the city continued its commute, and Arthur Vance, a man of unwavering routine, was swallowed by the morning. By 8 a.m., the scone he always bought remained on the bakery shelf. By 9 a.m., the tea in his apartment had gone cold. By noon, the Globe lay untouched on his doorstep. Arthur Vance, who had documented the histories of thousands, had suddenly and completely ceased to exist on his own. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a former colleague from the history department, was the first to notice the break in the pattern. She and Arthur had a standing lunch appointment every Wednesday at a small diner near the university. When he didn't arrive by 12:30, she wasn't just annoyed, she was worried. Arthur was not late. He was a man who believed punctuality was a form of respect. She tried his home number. The line rang and rang, finally clicking over to his answering machine, his recorded voice warm and academic. She left a message. She left another at 2 p.m. By 5 p.m., a cold knot of dread had settled in her stomach. She took a cab to Beacon Hill, using the spare key Arthur had given her years ago, in case of emergency. The apartment was silent. The air was still and cold. Elena called his name, her voice echoing in the book-lined hallway. In the kitchen, she saw the scene that would be seared into her memory. A single teacup and a small plate sat on the counter, clean and waiting. The teapot was half full of cold, dark tea. The sugar bowl was open. Everything pointed to a morning ritual interrupted, a man who fully intended to return in minutes. She moved through the apartment, checking each room. His bed was made, the coverlet perfectly straight. His wallet was on the dresser, containing cash and credit cards. His keys were gone, but his passport was in his desk drawer. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, no indication of a hasty departure. It was just an overwhelming, terrifying absence. Elena Ramirez called the Boston police at 5:47 p.m. Detective Michael Riley was on duty when the call came through. Missing persons cases for adults were tricky, people had the right to disappear. But something about this felt wrong from the start. A 68-year-old retired professor, meticulous, no health issues, no family conflicts, vanishing from one of Boston's safest neighborhoods. He met Elena at the apartment, her face pale. She explained Arthur's routines, his reliability, his character. Riley listened, his gaze sweeping over the orderly home. This wasn't the scene of a man who had run away. This was the scene of a life paused mid-beat. He and his partner began the grim work of an investigation with no starting point. They canvassed the neighbors, who all said the same thing. Professor Vance was a wonderful man, quiet, kept to himself, always polite. The last sighting was just after 6:15 a.m., turning the corner into the fog. They ran his finances, no activity since a bookstore purchase 4 days prior. No enemies, no debts, no secret life they could find. His sister in Atlanta was devastated, confirming he was in good spirits when they spoke just last Sunday. The man had simply evaporated. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing puzzle, take a moment to support the channel by hitting that subscribe button and liking this video. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. The investigation was going nowhere until they knocked on the door of Unit 2B, 2 floors below Arthur's. The man who answered, David Jennings, was 46, with pale, restless eyes and a demeanor of sour neglect. He was unemployed, lived on a small trust fund, and rarely left his apartment. When Riley asked when he'd last seen Professor Vance, Jennings became visibly agitated. He said he hadn't seen him, not that morning, not any morning. He claimed he was asleep. But his hands trembled. Riley pressed him. Did he know the professor? Jennings's face darkened. He admitted he knew him. He said the professor was arrogant, always walking like he owned the place. He complained that Vance's footsteps were too loud in the mornings, that his classical music in the afternoons was a nuisance. He admitted they had argued. Just last week, Jennings had confronted him in the hallway, accusing Vance of slamming the front door. Vance had apologized, but Jennings, according to his own rambling account, felt disrespected, ignored. A neighbor later confirmed hearing Jennings shouting at the professor, calling him an old fraud. Jennings denied any involvement, his voice rising in pitch. He had an alibi, of sorts. He claimed he was at a convenience store across town buying cigarettes at 6:45 a.m. It was a weak, unverifiable claim. When Riley asked to look inside his apartment, Jennings refused, demanding a warrant. Riley knew it was thin. He had no evidence, only a bad feeling. The man was obsessive, resentful, and clearly fixated on Arthur Vance. But in a city of millions, a bad feeling wasn't enough. The search expanded to the Boston Common, divers checked the frigid waters of the Frog Pond, flyers with Arthur's kind, academic face were posted on every lamppost. But the fog of October 28 had taken him, and as the days turned into weeks, the investigation stalled, frozen on the image of a half-full teapot and the simmering resentment of the man in Unit 2B. Detective Riley got his warrant for David Jennings's apartment 2 days later, but the victory was a bitter, chemical-tasting one. The moment the door swung open, the stench of neglect, a mix of stale beer, rotting food, and body odor, hit them like a physical wall. The unit was a shrine to squalor. Stacks of yellowed newspapers and conspiracy theory pamphlets formed teetering towers that blocked the windows, casting the room in a sickly light. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink and on the floor, some sprouting green-gray mold. The only clear pathways were a narrow, greasy trail from the front door to a deeply stained armchair, and from the chair to the kitchen and bathroom. It was the den of a man who had long since given up on the world, or perhaps declared war on it. They spent 6 grueling hours combing through the filth. The forensics team, working with the best technology 1998 had to offer, dusted for prints and found hundreds, all belonging to Jennings. They sprayed luminol across the floors and walls, the purple-blue glow appearing only over a spot where Jennings had clearly spilled a bottle of wine, the sticky residue still present. They checked the plumbing traps for any sign of a struggle, any evidence washed down the drain. They checked the closets, which were stuffed with more refuse and clothes that seemed to be decomposing on their hangers. They found nothing. No fibers from Arthur's wool coat. No blood. No sign that the professor had ever set foot inside this grim, suffocating space. Jennings himself sat in the precinct interrogation room, a picture of smug indifference. His lawyer, a slick, overworked public defender, had advised him to say nothing, and Jennings obeyed with a smirk. He just sat there, picking at a loose thread on his stained sweatshirt, watching Riley. "David, we know you had a problem with Professor Vance," Riley started, trying to keep his voice even. We have witnesses who heard you threaten him. Jennings just stared. Where were you between 6:15 and 6:45 that morning, David? The lawyer interjected, my client has already stated he was at the Star Mart on Cambridge Street. Riley leaned forward, the frustration burning in his throat. A convenience store 5 miles away, 30 minutes before he's seen on the tape. What was he doing? Walking? The lawyer shrugged. My client isn't obligated to explain his morning routine to you, detective. You have the tape. It shows him buying cigarettes at 6:51 a.m. Professor Vance was last seen at 6:15 a.m. Unless you're suggesting my client can teleport, he couldn't have abducted the professor, disposed of a body, and driven 5 miles in rush hour traffic in that window. Riley knew the lawyer was right about the timeline. It was tight, perhaps impossibly so. But the alibi stank. He'd watched the grainy, time-lapsed VHS footage himself, over and over, in a dark room at the station. The figure in the hoodie was a gray ghost, his build roughly matching Jennings, but it could have been anyone. The clerk, a tired college kid, had no memory of him. He's not on the tape before 6:51, Riley pressed. He could have done something, then driven like hell to the store to build his alibi. The lawyer smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. Prove it. Without a body, without a weapon, without a single piece of forensic evidence, the case against David Jennings was built on nothing but a detective's gut feeling. And gut feelings didn't hold up in court. The investigation, for all its initial urgency, slammed into a solid brick wall. Months bled into a desolate year. The flyers on the lampposts, with Arthur's kind, academic face, turned to soggy pulp in the winter snows and faded to a pale blue in the summer sun. Elena Ramirez, heartbroken, organized a memorial service at the university. The lecture hall was standing room only. Colleagues and former students wept, sharing stories of Arthur's brilliance, his quiet generosity, his unwavering support for students of color. But with no body, there was no grave to visit, no finality. It was a wound that couldn't close. The case was officially declared cold in 2000. David Jennings continued to live in Unit 2B, a living specter in the building. Other residents began to move out, unwilling to share a hallway with the man everyone knew had done it. He became Beacon Hill's boogeyman, a story told in hushed tones, the man who got away with murder. He was seen shuffling to the liquor store, his eyes always down, a cloud of resentment following him. Detective Riley kept the case file, bound in blue cardboard, on the corner of his desk long after it should have been relegated to the archives. He'd drive by the building on his way home from a late shift, looking up at Jennings's dark, curtained window, the frustration a physical ache in his chest. He re-interviewed the neighbors. He re-watched the tape. He reread the forensic report, hoping he'd missed something, anything. He never did. In 2015, after 30 years on the force, Riley retired. The day he cleaned out his desk, he personally carried the box marked Vance, Arthur, down to the cold case unit. He handed it to the unit's new leader, a sharp, tech-savvy detective named Keisha Adebayo. I know this guy did it, Riley told her, his voice rough. He tapped the smug, 1998 booking photo of Jennings. I just could never find the proof. Don't let him be forgotten. 7 more years passed. It is now 2022. Detective Adebayo, now a seasoned investigator with a reputation for cracking impossible cases, was reviewing her unit's oldest files. She was a digital native in an analog world of evidence, and she knew that old evidence, seen through the lens of new technology, could tell new stories. She pulled the Vance box. She read Riley's meticulous, frustrated notes. She saw the transcripts of Jennings's non-interview. Like Riley, she felt the fundamental wrongness of it, the simple, quiet man who had just stopped. She put in a request for all physical evidence. The clerk wheeled out a small, dusty cart. There wasn't much. fingerprint cards, the convenience store VHS, and a rotting cardboard evidence box from Jennings's apartment search. Inside, among a few other useless items, was a pair of muddy, worn-out work boots. They had been logged, photographed, and dismissed. In 1998, DNA testing required a visible stain, a quarter-size drop of blood or saliva. These were just dirty boots. But Adebayo had seen what the new MVAC system could do. It was a high-powered wet vacuum designed to pull trace DNA from porous surfaces, fabric, concrete, rock, surfaces that had previously been impossible to test. She tagged the boots and sent them to the state lab with a specific request: MVAC entire surface, especially seams and treads, and run full analysis on any soil particles. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. It was the lab supervisor, and his voice was electric. "You're not going to believe this," he said. The soil caked deep in the right boot's tread was a specific mix of clay and sand, inconsistent with the soil of Beacon Hill. But it also contained trace amounts of a specific limestone aggregate, a type of crushed rock primarily used in cheap, ready-mix concrete from a brand popular in the late 1990s. That was interesting. But the next part was the bombshell. "We MVAC'd the seam, where the rubber sole meets the leather," the supervisor said. Tucked deep in the stitching, protected from the elements for 24 years, was a single, microscopic speck of dried matter. It was dark reddish-brown. The lab team had spent days painstakingly isolating that one speck, then amplifying it using the latest generation of DNA sequencing. It was blood. They ran a profile. The sample was badly degraded, but they got just enough markers to run a familial DNA search against the national database. The profile came back with a high probability match, a first-degree relative, a woman in Atlanta who had submitted her DNA to an ancestry site years ago, hoping to find a family. Adebayo pulled up Arthur's file. The sister's name was Sarah Vance. Detective Adebayo stared at the report, her heart pounding. It was Arthur's blood. After 24 years, they had him. The blood was the link, and the concrete, she was suddenly certain, was the tomb. The DNA match was the key, but the concrete was the door. Detective Adebayo knew Jennings wouldn't just talk. She needed to find where he'd poured that concrete. She ran a comprehensive property search on David Jennings, going back 30 years. He had, as expected, sold his Beacon Hill apartment in 2004, cashing in on the skyrocketing property values and disappearing. But Adebayo wasn't looking at Beacon Hill. She was looking for other properties, any property. And she found it. A small, dilapidated single-family home in Revere, just north of the city, with a tiny, postage-stamp backyard. He had purchased it in 1995 and sold it abruptly in December 1998, just 6 weeks after Arthur Vance vanished. She pulled the satellite imagery. The backyard was almost entirely covered by a cracked, poorly laid concrete patio. Adebayo felt a cold, hard certainty. This was the place. She found David Jennings, now 70 years old, living in a cluttered, third-floor apartment in Somerville. He was stooped and thin, with the same pale, resentful eyes Riley had described. Adebayo brought 2 uniformed officers and, for his own closure, retired Detective Michael Riley, who stood in the hallway looking like he'd seen a ghost. "David Jennings," Adebayo said, her voice calm and steady. He opened the door a crack, the chain still on. "We're here about Arthur Vance." The name, after 24 years, still had the power to make him flinch. "I told you people." "I don't know anything," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper. "We have a warrant to speak with you, Mr. Jennings," Adebayo said. "And we have new evidence. Forensic evidence. From 1998. Jennings's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible." Adebayo leaned in slightly. "We found his blood, David. On your work boots. And we know about the concrete." Jennings's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. The flicker of panic in his eyes was all the confirmation she needed. He slammed the door. "Get a warrant," he shrieked from inside. "I've got one," Adebayo said, not to him, but to Riley. "For the house in Revere." The excavation began the next morning. The property in Revere was a small, sad-looking house, now owned by a young couple who were horrified to learn its potential history. The backyard was exactly as the satellite images had shown, a 10 by 15-foot patch of cracked concrete, surrounded by chain-link fencing. A forensic team brought in ground-penetrating radar. Within an hour, they had an anomaly. A rectangular shape, roughly 6 feet by 3, just under the center of the patio, where the concrete was thickest. The jackhammer started at 10 a.m., the noise echoing through the quiet residential street. They broke through the 4-inch slab, revealing dark, compressed soil beneath. The team switched to shovels, then to hand trowels. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation and the smell of damp earth. At 1:30 p.m., one of the technicians stopped digging. "Wait," she said, her voice muffled by her mask. She reached in with a brush. A dark, rotted piece of fabric was visible. It was wool, with a faint striped pattern. Adebayo checked her file. Arthur Vance was last seen wearing a scarf, a gift from his sister. They dug with painstaking care now. The fabric was attached to what, an hour later, was unmistakably a human skeleton. It was curled in a fetal position, crammed into a shallow, hastily dug grave. The team uncovered the skull last. The forensic anthropologist, kneeling at the edge of the hole, pointed with a gloved finger. "Here," she said, indicating a spiderweb of fractures on the left temporal bone. "Blunt force trauma. At least 2 blows. He never would have seen it coming." Tangled with the bones of the hand, they found a simple gold signet ring, the initials, AV, still legible. After 24 years, 3 months, and 14 days, Professor Arthur Vance had been found, buried under a cheap slab of concrete like a piece of refuse. Adebayo and Riley, with 2 new officers, went back to Jennings's apartment in Somerville. This time, they didn't knock, they used a battering ram. They found him in his stained armchair, smoking a cigarette, as if he'd been waiting. He didn't resist. He just looked tired. As Adebayo cuffed his frail, wrinkled wrists, the decades of malice seemed to drain out of him, leaving only a hollowed-out old man. Riley, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel for 24 years, held up the evidence bag containing the ring. "You know, all this time," Riley said, his voice shaking, "I wondered why. He was a good man. A better man than you'll ever be." Jennings was silent as they led him down the hall. Then, just as they reached the stairwell, he stopped and looked at Riley. His voice was quiet, almost casual. He was just so loud, he whispered. Always walking, back and forth. That music. Like he owned the world. Like I wasn't even there. He looked away, out the dirty hallway window. He shouldn't have been so loud. It wasn't a confession. It was an explanation, a pathetic justification that had festered in his dark apartment for half a lifetime. The news broke that evening and exploded across the city. Boston cold case solved, remains of missing professor found. It was the lead story on every channel. Dr. Elena Ramirez, now 82 and living in a nursing home, saw the report on the common room television. She watched, silent, as Arthur's kind, academic face from 1998 filled the screen, followed by the footage of the excavation, the flashing blue lights, the mugshot of a 70-year-old David Jennings. A nurse, seeing her distress, rushed over. Elena simply gripped her hand, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "They found him. Oh, Arthur. They finally found you." Arthur's sister, Sarah, flew up from Atlanta. Adebayo and Riley met her, and together they gave her the signet ring. She clutched it, the last piece of her brother, and her grief was a raw, physical thing, a 24-year-old scream that had finally been released. David Jennings, facing a mountain of forensic evidence and his own damning words, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, sparing the families a trial. He was sentenced to life in prison, a formality for a man of his age. He died of a heart attack in the prison infirmary 8 months later. 2 weeks after the arrest, Boston University held a proper funeral service for Professor Arthur Vance. The pews were filled with hundreds of people, former students who were now professors themselves, old colleagues, new detectives, and neighbors from Beacon Hill who remembered the polite man with the warm smile. Elena Ramirez, in a wheelchair, read a poem. Michael Riley sat in the back row, his eyes closed. Finally, Arthur Vance was laid to rest, his name carved in granite, his history no longer a question mark but a period. The fog over Boston would still roll in, but this one shadow, this one cold, haunting absence, had finally, after 24 long years, been given a name and a place to rest.